Welcome back. Gun violence epidemic. The country has been rocked by back-to-back mass shootings, from the one in Buffalo, New York, to the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, to the most recent one in Oklahoma.
But I'm here on this floor to beg, to literally get down on my hands and knees and beg my colleagues. Find a path forward here. Work with us to find a way to pass laws that make this less likely.
As the gun rights debate rages on and confusion arises amid the response to these crises, we'll talk about the recent events in our country, the response from our lawmakers, and I'll also sit down with the Stay With Me Here podcast's Jacob Shropshire to talk about the recent shootings and other major headlines. We'll be taking a look at those stories and more today, June 3rd, 2022. From Ishan Media, this is the Ishan S. Show, a podcast about the interesting and ever-changing world of American politics, all from the perspective of the youth. With me, your host, Ishan. Hello. Welcome back to the Ishan S. Show. Thank you so much for joining me here today. You know, when you didn't see that new episode last week, you thought I probably was going to go vanish for another 2 months or something like that. But I'm here. You know, last week I took off because right after I recorded the last episode about the primary elections, I ended up losing my voice completely. Like, not a sound. And so when you make podcasts, it kind of gets tough when you really can't hear your host speak. So I kind of thought maybe we should just take this week off. But I also had finals, because we still do that in high school. And it was also my birthday. You might have heard in the opening the little rebrand, Politics from the Perspective of the Youth. It used to be Politics from the Perspective of a 15-year-old. We had to change that a bit because I'm not 15 anymore. But yeah, I decided to take last week off for a multitude of reasons. But I'm glad to be back with you guys here today. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the works with the Ishan S. Show, so stay tuned for that. And I'm also very excited to share that interview I had with Jacob Shropshire earlier this week. That'll come in a bit. But for right now, let's take a look at some of our top stories for this week. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is entering its 100th day. And so far, Ukrainian forces have been very fierce and are holding up to Russian forces. But as of right now, a lot of eastern Ukraine is slowly being taken over by Russian forces. And President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has reported that over 200 kids have been killed in this war, and 200,000 have been forcefully taken away to Russia. Chilling. This war has sparked, as we discussed last week, some anxiety among other European neighboring countries, countries that neighbor Russia, specifically in Scandinavia, with Finland and Sweden, two foreign policy best friends, planning on joining NATO together. And that has sparked some condemnation from the Kremlin, but not a lot, not as much as we'd expect. The war has also prompted a global food shortage, with Russia and Ukraine both being major suppliers of grains like wheat and barley. That is kind of on hold right now, and because of the war, and so other countries, out of a fear of this shortage impacting them, countries like India have restricted wheat exports in an effort to save some food in this shortage. And that's why a lot of us around the world are seeing some of our food prices go up, because of the fact that countries are, number one, restricting their exports of this, but also because Russia and Ukraine, two major suppliers, are not able to do that stuff right now because they have other things that they're paying attention to. And then, speaking of increased prices, I guess, EU leaders recently agreed on a partial ban on Russian oil imports, which is a major move on their part because this would really risk a rise in energy and oil costs for people in Europe. But it would also hinder some of Russia's economic sway. And then we here in the United States also voted to pass that $40 billion aid package that I mentioned in the last episode. But more recently, we've decided, we meaning the president, has decided to send $700 million in further aid to Ukraine, which very hesitantly from the White House also includes rockets. They acknowledge the escalatory risks that come with these rockets, but they decided to send them. And then Queen Elizabeth of the United Kingdom is celebrating her Platinum Jubilee on the throne, which is 70 years, and makes her the first British monarch for sure, but even perhaps the first monarch to ever sit on a throne for that long, which, and by any measure, is a very impressive accomplishment. The entire country of the UK will be celebrating the 96-year-old monarch's milestone in a 4-day nationwide celebration and 2 bank holidays on Thursday and Friday. So congratulations to the Queen and the people of the UK. Okay, now let's get on to this week's topic. So this week's topic has been at the top of our headlines for weeks now, and it's not just this 3-week period, but it's this story that keeps coming back at us, and it's been happening for years. I'm sure you all know exactly what I'm talking about, which is the gun issue, the gun violence issue in our country. And look, this is tough to talk about, but it's an important discussion that we need to have. No matter what side of this issue you are on, whether you see keeping guns as a matter of freedom, or if you see guns as a threat to public safety, each and every American has to come together and say that enough is enough. You know, as a person covering this topic, I can't say how much I dislike having to see those articles and news stories and segments virtually every other week about another mass shooting somewhere in the country. And as a high school student, and I know with a large base of high school listeners, I know a lot of you can relate. I have to admit, we all have to admit, this is tough to watch. And there's always a thought in the back of your head when you're in high school right now that anything can happen. And so, to be straightforward, all I want to say is that it should not be a political statement to say that enough is enough. The gun violence issue in this country has to stop. All right. Now, with that being said, let's talk about what has been going on. So we have been rocked by back-to-back mass shootings across the country over the month of May and so far 3 days into June. I'd say that the major headlines really started with the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. There, in a predominantly black neighborhood, in a supermarket, an 18-year-old gunman, motivated by racist ideology, opened fire on 13 people, and 11 of the people shot were black. The shooter, who describes himself as a white supremacist, had actually written a 180-page manifesto filled with this racist hatred and published it online before he proceeded on with the shooting. The 10 people killed in this tragedy were all black, and they were all targeted by this gunman. The suspect was arrested in the days since. He has been charged with murder as well as domestic terrorism. And the fallout from this shooting was from across the country. People on both sides of the political spectrum expressed their outrage with this shooting, with that motive, but it was not a very unified response in how exactly we would address this crisis. And then here's to talk about one viewpoint. Here is Governor Kathy Hochul's statement on what happened. And then
a military-style execution targeting people who simply want to buy groceries in a neighborhood store. It strikes us in our very hearts to know that there's such evil that lurks out there.
Just 10 days after the Buffalo shooting on May 24th, another 18-year-old, this time in Uvalde, Texas, opened fire on an elementary school and shot 21 people dead. This includes 19 second through fourth grader children and 2 of their teachers. This was another instance of gun violence specifically at a school, and I believe this shooting in Uvalde is the worst school shooting in over a decade, and I believe it is one of the worst school shootings that this nation has ever seen. There's been a lot of confusion, though, about law enforcement's response to this shooting. There's not a really clear picture of what exactly was going on outside when the gunman was inside. And as more information from the Texas Department of Public Safety comes out, it appears that there was at least some uncertainty about the situation during the response while the gunman was inside. Texas Governor Greg Abbott said he was, quote, livid about not being told about this. Here's a clip of Abbott, a statement from him after the attack.
For someone to gun down little kids, it is intolerable and it is unacceptable for us to have in the state anybody who would kill little kids in our schools.
And in the days after the shooting, there was a lot of outcry from a lot of places. Here's a bit of that now viral clip from Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut on the shooting in Texas while it was happening, I believe. Connecticut, of course, where Chris Murphy is from, is where the Sandy Hook shooting happened, which was one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. Here's Senator Murphy.
But I'm here on this floor to beg, to literally get down on my hands and knees and beg my colleagues. Find a path forward here. Work with us to find a way to pass laws that make this less likely.
In the aftermath of the shooting, President Biden addressed the nation in a fiery speech, questioning where the progress in preventing these shootings have been. Here's a clip from President Biden's speech from that night.
The idea that an 18-year-old kid can walk into a gun store and buy 2 assault weapons is just wrong. What in God's name do you need an assault weapon for except to kill someone? Deer aren't running through the forest with Kevlar vests on, for God's sake. It's just sick. We can do so much more. We have to do more. Our prayer tonight was those parents lying in bed and trying to figure out, will I be able to sleep again? What do I say to my other children? What happens tomorrow?
And then here is a clip of Senator Mitch McConnell, Senate Minority Leader, Senator Mitch McConnell's floor speech the day after the shooting.
Our country is sickened and outraged by the senseless evil that struck Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, only yesterday. These innocent kids were simply going to school. They'd put on their backpacks, said goodbye to their parents, and headed off for another day of learning and friendship. There were only 2 days left before summer break. And because of this maniac, at least 19 of these kids never made it home.
So those aren't the only shootings that have happened. We saw just this Wednesday one in Oklahoma where a person bought an AR-15 to specifically target a doctor who performed surgery on him. 4 people ended up dying in that shooting. There was one in Chicago where a cop was shot. But it's these 2 shootings that happened in Uvalde and in Buffalo that we're talking about today that really dominated the headlines these past 3 weeks for things like the motive and the people impacted and so many other things. And in response to all of this, Congress is working to try to find a way to prevent these mass shootings from happening any longer. Senator Mitch McConnell sent Senator John Cornyn of Texas to meet with Senator Chris Murphy to discuss, quote, a basic framework for gun legislation. There's a lot being discussed. Red flag laws, background checks, and other things are all in viable discussion right now. And look, I believe that we'll see meaningful change in light of these tragedies in New York and in Texas, and I'm hopeful there will be at least some bipartisan agreement on whatever happens, and hopefully we do not have to see more mass shootings like this. Okay, so that was the discussion on the gun issue in this country. When we come back from the break, I'll sit down with the Stay With Me Here podcast's Jacob Shropshire to discuss the gun issue, foreign policy, and other topics. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break. All right, so we're back from our break. Now, our guest for today's episode is a co-host on the Stay With Me Here podcast, which is about our interesting world of American politics, but also takes a look at some of the more pressing stories on a global scale, from things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine to countries like the rise of countries like China in new areas of the world. And now to talk more about this stuff and other stories, we're joined by Jacob Shropshire of the Stay With Me Here podcast. Thanks for joining us, Jacob.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, before we get into our discussion for today's episode, why don't you take a few moments just to introduce yourself to my audience, your show, and yourself?
Sure. So my name is Jacob Shropshire. I am actually an undergraduate student at the American University of Paris in Paris, France. I'm originally from Oklahoma, so right here in the U.S. That's where I am right now this summer. And it's there that I'm studying journalism and international politics. And so it's also there that myself and Aaron Flanagan, my co-host on Stay With Me Here, we kind of met up and we started our podcast. We are looking at, each week we're looking at different topics in international relations. You know, obviously we're both Americans, so we do have a little bit of an eye for American news and politics and things of that nature, but we really try to keep things global and help people understand the world that they're living in a little bit better, and keep people informed about how those international forces are at work.
Which is key right now, because as we are in a more and more unpredictable political scene, especially geopolitical scene, it's now more important than ever to be educated on these matters. So thanks for that. Why don't we get into this episode's topic? And as you know, last week we had to see that horrific shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and where 19 kids were killed, as well as 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School. And that sparked another one of those major gun debates in our country between Republicans and Democrats. Right now, you have Texas Republicans saying that this is a mental health issue and we need to expand more access. Governor Abbott of Texas just introduced a new plan to address that. And then Democrats are saying this is a public safety issue and that we have to, or that a Democrat suggests directly attacking guns. So I wanted to get your quick take on this. Just what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to see any meaningful change in, stopping these mass shootings from Democrats or Republicans? Or do you think we're just going to stall again, as it's been for a while now?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's a few things at play here. First of all, the idea of meaningful change is a little bit hard to quantify. I think, David Hogg, who was someone who was in leadership for March for Our Lives, he was a student at Parkland during the Florida shooting a few years back, and he actually had a positive outlook on this. And he was saying, incremental change is actually still a positive thing, even if it doesn't, like, sometimes people really want this like massive change, and he's like, look, as much as we want that, like, it can't happen. Incremental change is what's possible. Let's do that. And so I think that kind of change is possible right now. It sounds like there's some actually serious bipartisan efforts going on right now. It's always hard to tell exactly how expansive those are. I think there's a lot of people federally who are willing to sign on to thing until the last minute. So I think that is something. There's also a level of this that it comes from people like we were talking about on our episode here recently that these politicians who make these decisions make their decisions based on political incentives, and if there are people out there who want politicians to change their mind, they have to also change the political incentives. And so that means organizing, that means calling around, that means all these different things. And I don't know for sure if that's what's going to happen here. There is, I think, a tangible difference in tone from the way people have absorbed this than in past shootings, at least in past shootings recently. It has, like you mentioned, it has reinvigorated this debate. I would say the one thing to watch out for would be like, this is an overtly political topic, and there's a length and breadth of people who have very legitimate opinions on the far left and the far right and everywhere in between. The one thing to watch out for would be people who say, let's not politicize this, because this is a political conversation. Like, this is when we were supposed to have this conversation, and that sort of distracts from real conversations we can have about things. So let's keep it to real debate, and we can have a thorough conversation about what the solution is going forwards.
All right. And just talking about even that Buffalo shooting where we saw the racist ideology behind it. How big do we've been seeing this increase, not just here in America, but just all around the world, in that Christchurch shooting in New Zealand a few years ago, as well as a few instances in Europe. We've also been seeing gun violence specifically associated with that increase in hatred towards certain groups. How do you think, how do you think our lawmakers right now in the United States, at least, are going about addressing that issue as well?
I mean, I think it's a very, very difficult issue to discuss. I was thinking about this the other day, just in terms of like the media freedom aspect of this, where this Buffalo shooter, he had this manifesto, and on some level, it's like, okay, do we publish the manifesto out there so that people can see what this kind of stuff looks like for research purposes? Do we keep it locked down because it might convince other people? It's a very, very complicated and delicate subject to sort of breach. I think there are serious concerns about what certain public media outlets have done by way of sort of giving people the in to these kinds of things. As horrific as it is, like the shooting in Buffalo was ideologically motivated, right? That and maybe in some ways that's what makes the shooting in Uvalde worse, is that it wasn't, and we can't really know what made him do that. But when it is ideologically motivated, like we have to look at what is the root cause of this, and how do we fix this. I don't know that it's an easy task for anyone. I don't know that it would be an easy task if there was, frankly, an authoritarian government who could do whatever they want with the snap of their fingers, much less a government that is completely, in gridlock, it feels like 90% of the time. And so I don't know that it's not an easy problem to solve. That doesn't mean it's not worth solving. We should have the congressional subcommittee. We should have the investigations by the FBI. We should be working on these things to figure out what, at a minimum, how do we mitigate these? There also needs to be a little bit more cultural awareness, I think, of what this stuff looks like. Until now, conspiracy theories, I think, have been seen as like, oh, it's, Uncle Rob has the tinfoil hat and he believes aliens are going to come down and abduct us. But, whatever, we're just going to let him say what he wants to say. And like now, conspiracy theories are getting dangerous. Like they're getting to a point where, people are, as we're seeing, acting on them in this sort of horrific way that is also follows these theories to their logical conclusion. And so making sure that we're not dismissing the power of a conspiracy theory. I was listening to a different podcast recently, and the fact is that like conspiracy theories are much better stories than the real world. Like the real world is very boring and conspiracy theories help tell these very interesting stories about the world we live in. And so, we have to make the real world, I don't know if we should make it more interesting, but we have to make it more clearly true.
Right.
We have to make sure that people are accepting of the truth. I think that's really important.
Okay. So let's switch gears a little. Now, the Stay With Me Here podcast, of course, focuses on those geopolitical issues. And I do, every time I listen to your show, I hear about those little updates that you have on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So why don't we talk about that? Right now, Ukraine has been doing a good job, I'd say, of resisting the Russian aggression that has fueled this war. And the West has been pretty much united in our response, in our response to Russia. Recently, as you might have heard, EU leaders agreed on that partial ban of Russian oil imports. And I know that there are still talks going on right now of issuing more severe sanctions on the Russian economy. So how long do you think it'll take for us, meaning the West, how long is it going to take us to just penalize Russia enough until they stop this war, if that may even happen?
Right. I mean, I think it all comes down to where Vladimir Putin draws his line, and that's not something that I think anyone in the West can figure out. I think it's been the biggest challenge since day one, is this question of, is he acting logically? Is he acting in a way that is a little bit erratic? It's kind of hard to figure out. I know that recently there's been some reporting that has said he is now sort of taking control over the war from his generals. He's like taking the job, which is not actually great. Like, typically when leaders do that, it doesn't lead to great things. But at the end of the day, like, it has to be so much more costly for Russia to continue the war than it is for them to withdraw. And those costs are going to be in a whole bunch of different ways. They're going to be military costs. Russia has been dealt with a lot of military costs. So is Ukraine, but Ukraine is fighting for something, I think, in a much more palpable way than Russia has been. And so these military costs are sort of translating into political costs for Vladimir Putin. Their economic costs, these economic sanctions are massive. These are some of the worst economic sanctions anyone in the world is getting. I mean, right now, Russia is on par with Iran when it comes to being sanctioned by the West. I mean, that is 3 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Just completely unimaginable. And so it's also going to be in terms of territory. And Russia has kind of said they're not going to end this war until they have at least some of Ukraine's territory. And Ukraine has said they're not really going to end this war until they have all of their territory back. And so it's hard to tell exactly how much of that is just posturing. Sometimes countries will kind of draw this line in the sand with the idea of it being a bigger concession when they actually sort of say, okay, well, whatever, we're going to move back a little bit, then they can pretend like it's a big deal. We'll see where he ends up going, but I think the thing we got to keep doing from the perspective of the US and the EU and NATO's response to all this is like, keep the sanctions on. The sanctions are working. They're the most fierce in the world. And just keep helping Ukraine, make sure that they can fight this war for themselves, and hope that Russia can come to its senses, whether that's Putin making that decision or whether he is sort of forced by political will from other places to make that decision. I think that's the only way out of this.
So then, do you think we might be talking about this war even a few years from now, perhaps? Could this be like another one of those wars that has just dragged on?
I think there's a real possibility. I don't want to negate that. I do get the sense that the war is sort of entering another phase right now in terms of the way negotiations are working, the way sanctions are working. I mean, you mentioned that the EU just passed this new oil embargo from oil that's being shipped in. So those kinds of things, I mean, like keeping the sanctions on, that's gonna make it harder and harder for Russia to continue the war. The bottom line is they need money to do this thing, and the longer they go, the less it's gonna be easy to get that money from other places. right now they're sort of selling their oil to other places. China and India are the two big buyers right now, but I would guarantee you they're not selling it at standard price. They're selling it at a marked down price, and so things like that. All that means I'm not totally convinced that this is going to go on for 3 years. I'm not saying it couldn't. My sincere hope is that there can be some genuine discussions about ways that this war can end, and leaders can get in the room and make some real actionable decisions about that.
Okay, and then you mentioned China in your answer there. So another a lot of experts are comparing this Russian invasion of Ukraine to a potential invasion of Taiwan by China. So how do you think our response, and just, the Western community in general, our response to this invasion, how do you think that might be influencing perhaps Chinese leaders who are looking towards Taiwan?
Well, I certainly think Chinese leaders are watching. That is pretty clear to me. Is they're watching to see how this plays out, to figure out exactly what the West will do if China tries to invade Taiwan. I have been skeptical about this for a little while, just because it very much is not an apples to apples comparison. The idea of sanctioning Russia is it's not a joke by any means, clearly affecting lots of things, but at least it's sort of a manageable impact domestically in the US and in Europe. If those blocs decided to go and sanction China, they could not handle it. It is so economically costly. And the thing is, like in international relations, we talked about relative power. The thing is, like, you never want to impose sanctions that just drag both parties down, right? Because if you drag both parties down, you actually haven't changed their relative position. You want to increase your country's relative position compared to the relative position of another country, and sanctions just drag both countries down. So I'm not sure the sanctions are exactly the same. That said, Biden was just in Asia here. I think it was last week. He was in Asia. He made some comments about Taiwan that kind of got him in hot water with all these people. He's really good at that. But he made these comments, and I think what was interesting about those actually is we kind of see where he is, we see where the US government is, and so he's sort of willing to go along with what has been the tradition of, like, we're gonna not really say exactly where we are on all this, whatever. But I think the fact is that, like, Biden does not see Taiwan and Ukraine as the same issue. He sees them as sort of similar. He does not see them as the same, and he made it clear that whatever happens, like if China were to invade Taiwan, the U.S. response would not be the same as what the U.S. did in Ukraine. And I think that is really an important point. That is really going to make a big difference in China's sort of calculation, the US's calculation, like the world calculation for if this happens, is what the US does. And so far, it sounds to me like it's a different enough situation where I don't know that it's entirely judgeable based just off of Ukraine.
All right. And then let's switch gears again a bit. This question now is less about what's going on in the headlines and more from me as a fellow podcaster. And as a person covering politics, people are always asking me, and I'm sure people ask you and your co-host about this all the time, but what is it like covering political news stories as a journalist right now in this political climate? We don't run a very, very big operation at the Shana Show, but, I've gotten comments myself from Democrats and Republicans saying, hey, you're biased towards the other side because somebody may not agree with my coverage of a story. And I'm sure this is something that journalists everywhere face. So how hard is it to cover stories now in this political climate? And how do you tackle this as a host on your show and as a journalist right now?
I can tell you the way I think about it is that the truth is not partisan. There's politics and there's the truth, and the truth exists outside of any sort of political leanings. And I remember seeing this comic one time, and the comic was these three frogs in this pot of water, and the first frog says, "This water is going to boil and kill us all," and the second frog says, "We're fine. It's just a sauna. Everything's good. We can be here forever." And the third frog says, "Okay, let's just stay here. Let's compromise. Let's just stay here for another 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, the water boils and all three frogs die. And it just goes to show that the center between two extreme positions is not necessarily the truth either. The truth can be on one side or the other. And there are times where the truth is beneficial to people on the left. There are times when the truth is beneficial to people on the right. There are times when it's beneficial to both, and there's times when it's beneficial to neither. And so making sure that as journalists, we're covering what is true, not necessarily what is beneficial to a political party, I think that is one of the most important things we could be doing right now. I also think I maybe it's overrated advice at this point, but I kind of don't care too much what other people say. I'm kind of look, I'm doing what I want to do. I'm talking about the things I want to talk about, and if you don't like it, go somewhere else. I'm not your podcaster. And so that's kind of where I land on it. There are certainly people out there who are doing some fantastic, NPR is one of the other great podcasting organizations that is they're well known for being very centrist, and also doing some fantastic unbiased reporting that isn't afraid to sort of tell the truth as it is. I think they're a great example for what to do in terms of making that distinction between what is true and what is partisan. It's a hard one to draw. It's a hard distinction to make a lot of the time, but it's really important. I think that's the big thing for me.
Okay. Well, Jacob, thanks for joining us here on the Sean S. Show today. If you want to hear more from Jacob and Jacob's co-host, Aaron, you can listen to the Stay With Me Here podcast, which has new episodes out every Tuesday. Thanks for joining us today on the Sean S. Show. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
All right, that was my sit down with Jacob Shropshire. Thanks to Jacob for sitting down with me for this week's episode. And thank you to you, the listener, for staying with us until the end of the episode. If you want to see my interview on the Stay With Me Here podcast, that will come out next week on Tuesday, so stay tuned for that. And I'll see you guys next week. And so that does it for us here today at the Sean S. Show. If you liked my commentary, then go ahead and follow at Sean S. Show on Twitter and at the Sean S. Show on Instagram for breaking news posts and updates about the show. If you want to learn more about political stories, then check out my political news blog on the SeanSShow.com and enter in your email to subscribe, and just check out the SeanSShow.com. And do us a favor and share this episode and all other Ishan S. Show content with your friends and family. It is the best way for this show to grow and get more people listening to it, and it helps out so much. Thanks again for all your support, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.